Okay, so today I want to talk about how to figure out what the best practices are for a given technology. The reason this is important is that there's a lot of different ways to get things done in any given technology, but communities tend to coalesce around a set of standards or best practices that are basically considered the proper way to do things. Now, if you're learning on your own or don't have the benefit of being on a team, it can be hard to figure out what these best practices are. And so I wanted to talk about a few ways of figuring that out today. Full disclosure, the idea for this video came from a conversation that I had with one of you because I have office hours. Feel free to sign up for those below. So I have 3 strategies for learning best practices. They are 1, reading other people's code, 2, educational resources, and 3, getting feedback. So let's start with reading other people's code. So the good thing about open source software, say React is an example because that's the majority of what I do. React has a lot of prominent developers and a lot of people that build in public, a lot of public projects out there online on GitHub for you to go look at. Reading through the code for a well-known open source project can be a great way to pick up on new patterns and figure out how people that are at the top of the game actually write code. It's safe to assume that the people who are operating at the highest level are doing something that would be considered a best practice for the most part. Now, I'll get into where to look for these projects in just a second, but suffice to say, this is a really good place to start. Along with open source, a kind of subset of open source that I think is really helpful in this particular regard are boilerplates. Now, if you're not familiar, boilerplates are basically like a default setup. So you may know that React, for example, is very flexible and you have to make a lot of choices about how to set things up, how to structure your components and write them, how they interact with each other, how to set up Redux, for example, or some other kind of global state management. There are just a lot of choices to make. So finding a good boilerplate can not only help you get a head start on a project, but it can be a good source of patterns that you can use throughout your project. I'll link a well-known React boilerplate below just as an example, which I think would be a really good starting place and a really good learning resource. So that's reading other people's code. I also wanted to talk about educational resources. So let's start with creators. There are a lot of people that put out a lot of really good content for free. And in most software communities, there are people that kind of rise to the top. So again, using JavaScript as an example, because that's what I know, we have people like Wes Bos, Kent C. Dodds, Tyler McInnes that are all really great at JavaScript and more specifically React. So I would go and read their blogs. Kent C. Dodds in particular puts out a ton of great content on his blog. Most of those people also have courses, and that can be a great way to learn if you can afford it. A quick hack here back to reading other people's code. Wes Bos has all his repos to his courses out there open on GitHub. And so if you can't afford a course, a way to read his code at least would be to go to the repos for those courses, let's say his React course, and you can look through the finished project. And that is a great way to pick up on those patterns like I mentioned, even if you can't afford the course. Another option would be a course site like Egghead that has courses from a lot of different people. And that can just be a good way of getting exposure of a lot of different ways of doing things. But even sticking with one really solid creator like Wes Bos, for example, would be great. You don't need necessarily to be exposed to a whole lot of people if you don't want to be. The advantage of course sites though are that they tend to have more variety than one single person can put out. So those are educational resources. There are more than enough for most technologies, I would guess. But something that can be really rare is feedback. And so I wanted to wait and talk about that last because it may be the most important thing. So the benefit of coding in a professional environment is ideally you have other developers around you and they can give you feedback on your code, introduce you to new patterns, and let you know when you're going astray or if you're doing something in a way that could be done better. If you don't have the benefit of other developers around you, there are a few ways around this, and probably the best way is to get a mentor. So I've talked in the past about the site Mentor Cruise. There's also sites like codementor.io, and basically these serve as places where you can get somebody for an hourly rate and get them to teach you something or help you get unblocked. And in this case, I think people on these sites would be really good for giving feedback on your code. So that would be a really solid way to get feedback from a more experienced developer. But there are also great communities out there like Free Code Camp where people are just tending to help each other because it's an open community. So if you could find some more experienced peers on a platform like Free Code Camp, then that strategy could also be really great for getting some feedback on your code. I think the point with all this is that the internet has made it possible with a little bit of effort to find things out that you previously would have had to find out sitting next to somebody in an office environment. But now we have blogs, we have sites like CodeMentor, we have courses, and there's just a lot of ways to figure out what the best practices and standards are for any given technology. So those are my strategies. I hope you found them helpful. If you enjoyed this video, then you'd probably like the rest of my channel, which focuses on software engineering and career development. Regardless, thanks so much for watching to the end. Consider subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.